No, it's lots of. Lots of stuff. It's on the app store. I thought about that. I'm getting much of it. Well, that's just the thing. They didn't say that. That's another thing.
Is that where we're at? All right. What colony did Japan want to take to get their own oil? What is it?
No.
Dutch. I'll give you a hint. This is called the West Indies. Yeah, the Dutch East Indies. Yeah, the Dutch East Indies. Today, what country is the Dutch East Indies? Said it. Indonesia. I heard it. So no, Indonesia. And what was the administration in the United States that dealt with inflation? Did a pretty good job, at least to the war end. OPA, Office of Price Administration. And what was the nickname for women who enter the workplace? Very good. And what's the name of the code of the samurai? Bushido. And never bring. What's the biggest form of dishonor? Surrendering. And all loyalty to what person? What God on earth? The emperor. And what was the turning point battle where 4 battleships were sunk? Yeah. What did they miss at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese? Aircraft carriers, dry docks, yeah. The Yorktown never would have finished, one of those great stories. So let's get back to Europe. Really quick. We can't cover great detail of the Eastern Front for obvious reasons, but in 1943, Germany would do their last major offense, and it's called the Battle of Kursk. So basically, this line right here, it's this line right here. That's where the German line was after Stalingrad. There's a little salient bulge in the line, and Germany thought they would pinch that off. Give you an idea how limited it was. In 41, a massive offensive all the way. 42 here, that failed. 43, just here. And if you count, it's by far the biggest tank battle ever. And by the number of men, equipment, planes, it's the biggest battle maybe in history. The Battle of Kursk. And the Soviets were waiting because, remember, the British had broken their code and they warned them. And even though the Germans advanced a little bit, the Soviets counterattacked, not only stopped the Germans, not only pushed them back, but broke the back of the German army. It broke them. Here's Soviet forces on the advance. The Germans made a bunch of new tanks that were technically could have been better than Soviet ones. This is called a Tiger tank. But they broke down a lot, had a lot of problems. Also, remember slave laborers. And this, Germany never could recover. Never. So this is going to be hard, bitter, unbelievable fight. But the German army was broken. And once again, only small amounts of U.S. forces were even involved in Europe at all. Gives you an idea about the size of this war. And so, this is going to trigger a series of massive Soviet counterattacks. And these are some of the biggest offensives of the war. Like in June 1944, to coincide with D-Day, Operation Migration, brought Europe took all of this land in about 2 months. Only reason the Soviets couldn't advance more is they would break through the German lines. Even the Germans inflicted horrific casualties. But they'd run out of supplies, wait for the supplies, move up and attack again. So going into 44, the Soviets would eventually sweep into Poland, and through the Balkans, the Germans would have to retreat. It's hard to describe what a big deal this was. And you can imagine the Western allies watching this. Oh my gosh, nothing can stop the Soviet army. This communism must make them 10 feet tall. How can little United States of Britain stop it? So, one more thing. The Germans liberated those areas of the Soviet Union. Or I'm sorry, when the Soviets liberated the areas of German-held Soviet Union, they could not believe the atrocities. But remember the hunger plan, starvation, finding mass graves, the murder of thousands of POWs. 50% of the POWs would be killed. Most would starve to death. And mass killing of civilians and the number of rapes of Russian women is a billion. It's unreal what they saw. You can imagine what they saw. There's a story of when the German POW, I didn't tell you the story, that thing on the 12th. I jumped the gun. When German prisoners are taken at Stalingrad and they're being walked out at that hard bitter fighting, the story of a Soviet officer grabbing out a German officer, a starving German officer, and pulled him out and said, "Wait till we get to it." So we'll see what they do to Brooklyn. Well, you can imagine, at first, the Soviets were desperate for the United States and Britain to open up another front, called a second front, meaning attack France. After Kursk, they're like, do what you want. That's when the Allies said, we better get going. Nothing can stop them. So, will there be a second front? Well, one thing, in 42, there's no way. And Britain didn't want another battle of the Somme. The US had to build an army. And so, the first real second front will actually be a minor battles across North Africa. The Italians try to take Egypt. Oh, thank you. And where am I at? Oh, this was Vichy France territory. The Allies would attack her. I can't go into detail of North Africa, but the Germans and the Italians would be driven out. And then they attacked Sicily, the football. And after that happened, the Mussolini's government fell. But the Germans would just occupy the rest of Italy. Then they decided to attack Italy. So if you've ever been to Italy or know anything about Italy, it's all mountains. It's a narrow peninsula. It's really hard to take. And so even though Rome fell, it took about 7 months to get from here to here to get Rome. The fighting was that intense, and that turned into just a black, awful, bloody fighting. Eventually, all of Italy would be taken by the end of April 1945, meaning that wasn't going to open up. Stalin at first was mad, then so another effort. Oh, back here. When this part of French colonies were taken, Casablanca's in present-day Morocco, then the colony of Morocco, and Churchill and Roosevelt had a big summit. And these were big political affairs, so they could talk about unification for war. They'd also just met with Stalin in Tehran, World War. And in it, Roosevelt announced that the Allies will accept nothing but unconditional surrender. And he claimed, just like US grant back in the Civil War, unconditional surrender. That means no terms, no deal. You quit fighting and we'll let you keep your leader. You keep fighting, we'll let your army be paroled. You keep fighting, you can keep your emperor. That's what we call a hint. And they said unconditional surrender, which is logical when fighting Nazi Germany. They got to be completely defeated. But against Japan, it's something else. But unconditional surrender means if there's no terms, they'll fight to the end. Now, Roosevelt, a lot of people say Roosevelt made a mistake saying this. He didn't. He wasn't talking to the Germans or the Japanese. He was talking to the Soviets, specifically Stalin. Stalin had made a deal with Germany back in 1939. They didn't. They were worried Stalin would make a deal, another deal with Hitler, because the US and Brits weren't involved. So we're telling the Soviets, we'll fight to the finish, you fight to the finish. The problem is, now the United States are stuck with unconditional surrender. Stuck, especially when it comes to Japan. So, back to the fight. The United States believed, and Britain especially too, believed they could use heavy bombers and knock out Germany. Remember total war, knock out factories, terrify civilians? This is called strategic bombing. All those ICBMs around Great Falls, we call those in military terms strategic weapons. So it's not going to win a battle, but it will knock out their factories so they can no longer fight. The Royal Air Force, the Brits, had lost so many planes they bombed at night, meaning they really couldn't hit anything. They bombed at night. The US Army Air Force, bombed at daylight. So let's see, that's B-17, that's on my shirt. A B-17 Flying Fortress. And this was bloody, horrible fighting. Combination of German fighters and anti-aircraft guns, knocked down so many planes, over 46,000 American aircrew died on it. Most people don't realize how bloody and horrible it is, and terrifying for the crew. And so German POW camps would be filled with American and British aircrew. And it couldn't really hit anything. It didn't work very well. They lost a lot of planes, and it was relatively limited, and not the way they thought. Industry was hard to hit, and it was actually much quicker than anyone thought to rebuild a factory. They could really do it quick, get things going again. And we have found that out in every war, the United States, including what happened in Iran. It's amazing how fast they got production going in it after they were hit. Amazing how fast. But dehousing was what they call, and that was a relative success. What is dehousing? Meaning you're targeting who? You're killing civilians. And they say dehousing means we're not trying to kill them, we're just trying to eliminate their house so they become refugees. Killing them. That's bullying. Now, it had some limited bombing, but what's really successful were United States fighters. Beginning in 1944, US fighters had enough range to escort bombers all the way from Britain to Berlin and back. And this plane right here would be a war winner. And one of the greatest planes ever built, the P-51 Mustang. I like World War II fighters. I love P-51. That just was beautiful planes. And there's a guy in Helen, or a guy in Montana has one. Every once in a while you might hear it fly over him. It has a very distinctive buzz in its engine. It's really a cool looking plane. Especially if you like planes. But here's a German fighter plane, a Falke Wolf being shot down by a P-52. That's a stun cannon. German plane being shot down. What a picture. It just destroyed the Luftwaffe. The Germans had good planes. Their air force is called Luftwaffe. But they weren't as good as the P-51, and they didn't have oil to train their pilots. How do you train your pilots if you don't have oil? Japan would have the same problem. So inexperienced pilots would get knocked out of the sky by experienced, well-trained American, and with good planes. But the British had great planes, but just not long range. It's a really allied plane. The plane design's American and the engine's British. So it's an allied weapon. So, by D-Day, the German Air Force was basically destroyed. And that would be the second front, Normandy. The decision was to invade right here. This is only 20 miles apart here, but the Germans had this heavily defended. Had to be an area where there was beach, so that they could have flat bottom landing craft go up on the beach, unload troops, and then pull out and get more. So they needed beaches. This couldn't land here, swampy. Beaches can't use heavily defended. There's beaches here. And so even though it's further away from Britain and a lot further from Germany, they attacked here. So the Germans had defended this, but not as much as here. Also, for the smaller planes, it was in range. I was about here. That's where they had to attack. The Germans had mostly second-rate troops, but in certain spots, very good troops. But most of the best troops are fighting the Russians. So there are going to be 5 landing beaches, and there's only one beach we have to know. Now they're named after the code names. It's amazing. You go there today, the French call them these names too. So we have Sword and Gold, British, Juno, Canadian, Utah was American, and then the most important beach, because it's right in the middle, codename Omaha. All roads lead to Omaha. We've had Omaha before, and you know how important Omaha is. If you go there today, it's Omaha Beach. And the Germans defended that the most because it's in the center. If they hold the center, these smaller beaches might be easier to beat back. And this beach, the Canadian beach, was the strongest. There's also high cliffs. And they knew this would be incredibly difficult. But the assumption was they thought they'd break out pretty fast. June 6, 1944 would be D-Day. Anybody know what the D stands for? Huh? I've heard death. I've heard do. You want to know what it stands for? The D stands for day. Stay day. It's the important day. Anybody want to guess what the important hour was they landed at? That's each hour. Yeah, that's all it means. There's hundreds of D-Days. Every island attack was a D-Day. But this is the D-Day that everyone knows. So yeah, doom, death, destruction. Not just day-Day. Kind of boring. And the overall commander of all Allied forces was America because the US were contributing more and more supplies. A British commander, Montgomery, would actually commanded the actual invasion. But Dwight Eisenhower, never been in combat, but was a brilliant staff officer, could organize, and a brilliant politician. Hey, if you're holding a multinational coalition together, you need a politician. And he was one of these guys, he'd be affable and friendly and charming, and also ruthless and in command when necessary. He's going to come out of the war with an incredible reputation. And for the most part, deserved. I like a lot, like I think. He talks to paratroopers who would land the night before and take bridges and the flanks of the landing. Here are US soldiers in landing craft on the way to Omaha Beach. And you can see the cliffs behind, and these cliffs are why it's so hard to take. Because the Germans could be off the cliffs, they'd be plunging cars. We don't have time to go into a lot about D-Day. We've done that many times in special topics. It's a really interesting topic. But Omaha Beach about failed, but a few American units were able to scramble up the hills and drive the Germans back, and they held a toehold, but they held. The rest of the beaches were relatively successful. My grandpa landed that evening on June 6th on Utah Beach. So he didn't land with the first waves, but he landed that evening. And he would finish the war in Czechoslovakia. He fought all the way, yeah. Yeah, it was on Omaha Beach, yeah. And some Rangers were going to attack. These were like special forces. Same. Over here was a place called Point du Hoc, but they didn't have the landing craft, so they landed on Omaha Beach. And the movie, it's parts of it are fantastic. It's a tough one to watch. And so they thought they would break out relatively quickly. The Germans sent everything they had to hold them here. And the terrain was really rough. And one more thing, German tanks broke down a lot, but American Sherman tanks, which the British also had a lot of, remember Lend-Lease, were no match for the German tanks going on. And they kept that secret from the American public. The American tanks were inferior. But you know, a lot of pair them faster. And by August, they were stuck here, and then literally they broke out. And when they broke out, things happened so fast that they thought the war was going to end by Christmas. They broke out and liberated France in less than a month. I mean, Paris just fell. I mean, it happened so fast. My grandpa still talks about, my grandpa would talk about that since he passed away, but he would talk about how awful, awful, awful. Next thing you know, they're driving along and it's like, wow, this is great. He's still mad that we couldn't get into Paris. He figured the people of France would be very, very, very happy. So I took advantage of that. You know, somebody might die the next day, so we wanted to, you know. So they got to here, and then they ran out of supplies. And so they thought the war might be over by Christmas. By the fall, they literally ran out of supplies. A similar thing happened to the Russians, who got all the way to the gates of Warsaw and stopped. When the people of Warsaw revolted, Stalin let them wither on the vine, because he wanted only people he trusted in charge of home. And so, with that, the Germans are going to try one more counterattack. And for reasons that are absolutely delusional, Hitler decided he could knock out the British and the Americans, who would then turn around and join the Germans and defeat the Bolsheviks. So he's going to attack right here. Wait till the winter, go through the Ardennes one more time. And this is so delusional, it's beyond comprehension. He was on a cocktail of drugs. I mean, he was a loon. Just, it was hidden by his audacity. But he was younger. Called the Battle of the Bulge. It's the last major German counterattack. And American forces were originally taken totally by surprise. And they put a bulge in the line. That's why it's called that. But after the initial shock, Americans held every city. These held them back, or a place like Bastion. were surrounded by 4 days and held on, and the German offensive failed, and this would be Americans' biggest victory. The biggest battle that Americans were involved in, and the biggest victory, the Battle of the Bulge. And miserable fighting. As luck would have it, the coldest winter in history up to that time was 44, 45. And that's, of course, when we had our troops there. And you'll notice how we don't have a lot of American forces in a winter here. They had such supply problems, they have trouble getting out to the west too. Because they're still driving stuff back from the beaches. Well, this is the thing. Even though the Germans used up their last reserves and they're done. Allies weren't sure. And they were desperate to try to figure out a way to end the war. Could the Germans do this again? Are they stronger than what we think? Weren't. But they thought they might. And so the United States and Britain are going to change tactics. Why? To try to drive the Germans to surrender. So total war to the extreme, and it would start with Dresden. Dresden is a town, if you look right here, Dresden's right here, south of Berlin. It's considered one of the most beautiful towns in Germany. Beautiful Baroque and medieval art. It had not been bombed before because it didn't have a lot of industry, and because of that, it was a center point for refugees. As the Soviets advanced here, German refugees went there. Hundreds of thousands of them. There's also thousands of Allied POWs there. Hadn't been bombed. So they decided to make that a showcase of US and British air power. Over 500 British bombers hit starting a little before midnight on the 13th and all night, dropping white phosphorus. I think I told you what white phosphorus is. Didn't I tell you about what that is? It ignites as soon as it catches air. It's a form of phosphorus, and it will burn as long as it has fuel and oxygen. So if you dump water on white phosphorus, it doesn't put it out. It burns harder because there's oxygen in the water. If it gets on your skin, think of all the oxygen that's in your blood. The wounds are unreal. And so this is a firebomb. The other firebomb was brand new, invented by the DuPont Corporation, called napalm, which is called jelly gasoline. And they dropped billions of gallons of napalm, thousands of tons of white phosphorus, and set Dresden on fire. And then during the day, over 700 US bombers bombed the firefighters to destroy it. They laid waste to Dresden. Laid waste to it. Over 40,000 people. Oh, one more thing. So they firebombed it. And remember I told you about Hamburg they did back in 43? They did other limited efforts. This was another massive effort. Over 40,000, but we don't know how many because we don't know how many refugees. And thousands of people were asphyxiated. They went down to their bomb shelters when they heard the air raid warning. But the fire was so big, it created something that had only been created a couple times in world history. Only one other time by men, by humans, and that was at Hamburg. It's called a firestorm. So when the fire gets big, fire needs oxygen. So it sucks in oxygen. When the fire gets big enough, it sucks in all the air, all the oxygen. So if you're in a bomb shelter under this for the firestorm, the oxygen is sucked out and you asphyxiate. So they opened up hundreds of bomb shelters and they had just all rows of people sitting there. Asphyxiate. The winds will get as high as 120 or 130 miles per hour as it sucks in oxygen. It's sort of unreal. Then the fire gets hotter and burns until it just runs out of fuel. Firestorms. Fire is the big killer. Imagine the firestorm created by it. And, one thing I'll say about this. A POW was the American POWs there greatly affected them, and we've become one of the greatest authors in American history for buying. One of the greatest authors was a POW. And his greatest book is about this, Dresden. And also aliens and all sorts of stuff. It's an interesting book. I really like it. But it's called Slaughterhouse Five. That's where he was. So it wasn't just to force the Germans to surrender. This was going to be in the Soviet occupation zone now. And this was going to be a message to the Soviets. You might have the strongest army in the world, But look what the Allied Air Forces, the British and the Americans, did. So your army might be strong. Your army might be invincible. But look at our Air Force. This was a conscious message to the Soviets. Gee, I wonder if this is going to be an issue with the later on. Did you catch that? Because how do you convince Stalin to stop? They were really worried. Now, of course, have to, but that's going to trigger firebombing all over Germany. They started firebombing cities. The only reason they didn't firebomb more is they were running out of firebombs. And so this map shows the percentage of towns absolutely destroyed. I don't mean partially, I mean absolutely. Like about 40% of Berlin gone. About 90% of Dresden, 60% of Hamburg, Munich, all these major cities, they firebombed everything. You go to Germany today, and it's hard not to find something about the war. So you go to even little towns, you see like all these really old buildings, and then a new one. Why is there a new, or like a whole city block is new? Why? Bombing from World War II. And Berlin, Munich. Trying to force the surrender, it didn't work. But then when the March rains ended and the Soviets attacked on one end and the Western Allies on the other, Germany collapsed. And when it happened so fast. The end of March, the Allies broke through here and there was nothing. Nothing to stop it. The Soviets got here, and then in August or in April, they did a massive attack. My grandpa actually was awarded a Bronze Star for bravery right about here. He rescued a few Americans, drove behind German lines. They're surrounded in a Jeep and pulled them out. Got hit in the leg, but nothing horribly bad. Bad enough. He was awarded the Bronze Star. And his unit went all the way into spot. And Berlin, the fighting was as fierce as you could imagine. Hitler would not allow full defenses, thankfully, but it still didn't mean Berlin was not useful. It'd be fighting brick by brick, building by building. And some fanatical Nazis who realized we're going to be killed for what we did fought to the death. Other German civilians were wrapped into it. Thousands of Germans would be executed by other Germans for not fighting hard enough. It was hell on earth. That's a Brandenburg Brigade afterwards. Soviets celebrating. This was their greatest victory. Their Germans being taken prisoner. And what the Soviets would do to Germany that they conquered would be revenge. They would lay waste and the number one thing, looking back for Berliners, would be responsible for the Germans. And so remember what I said, a war of annihilation. Just absolutely. Berlin fell. And it's interesting how it's all over. You go to Berlin, any building that survived still have pockmarks, including the Reichstag. They have this museum island that's some of the greatest museums I've ever been to. And they're just filled with shell holes. Because they're big cement buildings that survived, but they are still still have marks from World War II. It is unreal when you go there. And then the legacy of the Cold War. Berlin is really amazing. And bratwurst, you like bratwurst? Really good bratwurst? Okay, I'm back to food. I can't help it. So, when Berlin fell, the 1,000-year Reich ended. I should add 200 yards from Hitler's bunker where he was hidden near the Reichschancellery, his home essentially. He would commit suicide on him. His successor would surrender a week and a half later. So, the 1,000-year Reich, I do like this with Hitler. That's what he said, 1,000 years lasted 13. There are Germans going out to invade Poland, a celebration of the 1,000-year Nazi Reich, and these are German POWs. Absolute and total defeat. But at a horrible cost. VE Day would be on May 8th. I do enjoy this picture of all the German generals surrendering. Don't worry about Keitel, he's going to sign the surrender. An absolute victory. So, after an incredible sacrifice, British, American, French, and Soviet forces. But everybody who knew what the Soviet army had done. After World War I and every other war, the US wanted to go back to peacetime conditions. About the Soviets. Oh, and Japan. They had not quit yet either. So what about the Pacific? The United States is now stuck with unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender. And so when they began to counterattack, at first they did a couple islands in the periphery that the Japanese held. Hell on Earth at a place called Okinawa. And massive battles here, where the Americans finally did destroy a lot of the remnants of the Japanese fleet. But the Japanese are going to hold every island. So what the US did, it's called island hopping. And island hopping was this: avoid heavily defended islands, take other islands, build an air base, attack the next one. So for example, Rabaul, the Japanese had built in the fortress. The Americans and the Australians leapfrogged it and let it wither on the vine to the end of the war. Same with Truk, another big base, just left it and let them wither. But would they have to invade Japan? And remember Bushido? Could you only imagine how hard the Japanese fought on these islands? What would Japan be like? So, Japan was by 1944 in absolute desperation. Oh, let me backtrack one thing right here. So, for example, thousands of US soldiers and Marines would die taking Guam and the islands right here. So it's very black. I can't go through every island, as interested as I am in this, and I hope you are too, but we have time, which is Japan's in absolute desperation. They know they can't win the war. Heck, they knew it by the end of 42. There's no way they can come up with some kind of peace terms that will give them the victory. But remember Bushido. Bushido, they wanted honorable peace. And more the honorable peace was to keep their traditions, to keep the basis of their government, which is wrapped around about one thing: keep the emperor. That's a condition, though. So how do you get that condition? They know they can't win the war, but let's take so many Americans with it. Make the war so horrible that the US would negotiate some kind of peace. A US victory, but not unconditional surrender. We'll keep our emperor, keep our power structure, keep Japan, no occupation zone, but we lost. But we didn't really lose because we're still there. So that's their plan. And so, when Americans would attack islands, hold every inch of that island, field as many as possible until they go, God, we have to do this again. We have to do this again. That is why, for example, they resorted to this. Nobody would risk a trained pilot like this, but they adopted kamikaze, suicide bombers. Why? To make it so horrible. You don't want to kill pilots. It's incredibly hard to train them. But how do you find somebody who will not stop it? Even when they know that their plane is going to get shot down, they keep coming. They wanted to hurt American morale to make it so awful, we sue them. They even came up with a rocket kamikaze. It wasn't very effective, but terrifying. It was just to get in the American mind. So here is a kamikaze pilot ready to go. They didn't have enough fuel to train a lot of pilots. But what's the easiest thing to do if you're flying a plane? The first easiest is steering it. The second, taking off. What's the hard part? Landing. You don't need to land. And they can make planes fly out and turn them into suicide bombs. Here is a US carrier called the Bunker Hill that was hit. This really devastated. And that's an attack on another aircraft carrier. But they would never do this except for the simple fact of desperation for this goal. They want Americans to believe that every Japanese civilian in Japan will become a suicide bomber and therefore sue for this. Was that the truth? No. Japan, that would not have been what happened. But they wanted Americans to believe that. So they took these islands here. The Philippines in bloody fighting would be taken in 44, 45. But now they're getting to the Japanese home islands, where they know the Japanese would defend even for our small little islands right here called the Bonin Islands. There's one in there that's not much bigger than the Helena Valley called Iwo Jima. But they wanted it for the airfields, for fighter planes. And so the Americans, Marines attacked, all Marines, on the 19th They thought it would take about 3 days. It's over a week of fighting that you can't even comprehend. Iwo Jima is this. It's a volcano and then the ash that created an island. And back in 1944 or 45, it was still just ash. And they would try to dig in, it would get hotter and steam would start coming out because it's so close to the magma. It was that miserable. And it's already getting super hot. This is a really interesting picture. It's scary too. U.S. Marines taking the long ride of their landing craft towards, that's the Mexican mountain. And the Japanese filled the mountain with tunnels and artillery. That's almost impossible to get, so they could plunge fire down there. They had over 21,000 troops, and they knew they were all going to come. They wanted to take every American and kamikaze, but not a lot. And I thought they could land, take the beach pretty fast. The fighting was so difficult. And to take Suribachi would cost over 2,000 Marines lost their lives. When they got to the top of the mountain, they're shelling at it. The second flag they put up on top of the mountain, let the people below it, the Americans know. An AP photographer took this picture. My guess is all of you have seen that picture. I should say the Marines on the ground just started cheering. It was a big deal, even though they knew there's going to be a lot more of it. Oh, and it's just flat. Except for the mountains, there's no place to hide. Look what it looks like today. So now it has some green. There are tour groups that go there. But there's not really anything there. But they go there and a couple of things just for mostly Americans to go to Iwo Jima. And that would become the Marine Memorial near Arlington. It's in Virginia, right before the Potomac. And in fact, I took this picture so you could see where it's at. Lincoln Memorial right there, Washington, Capitol. It's really beautiful. President Trump wants to go to 250-foot arch of that tunnel. To block them. Yeah. Oh, I forgot Flamingo Friday. Should we do Flamingo Friday now? Let's finish Okinawa. Okinawa would be the other. 21,000 Japanese soldiers. Only a couple hundred will take the president. Most of them will 21,000 Marines. Marines. No army reserve. Marines and sailors. And you can see them huddled in the ash. It's just awful. And there's no vegetation there. Oh, hell on earth. 21,000 Japanese soldiers, 7,000 Marines. That's what I meant. What could the invasion be? 2 months later, the decision to attack Okinawa. Okinawa was a much bigger island. This is going to be the biggest amphibious invasion in history. Bigger than D-Day. The reason it was bigger than D-Day is because everything had to be on board ship. It's over 10,000 ships. Most of the American, some Australian, the British actually, now that Germany's defeated, now could start using their own, their navy too. Okinawa. They thought this would take a month. It took over 2 months. And that's an Amtrak amphibious vehicle. There are Marine Force Air fighters. They landed here. They quickly advanced here, and there were no Japanese. No Japanese soldiers. Over 130,000 Japanese soldiers dug themselves in a tiny little area that is about the size of Lewis and Clark County. And it's pretty mountainous. And so they dug in. Their plan was to take as many Americans out as possible. And then, so close to Japan, they could hit them from Japan. Here are Marines, bunker by bunker, foxhole by foxhole, little hole they would dig, flamethrowers, casualties were unreal. Okinawa was hell on earth. And the invasion fleet was hit by the largest kamikaze attack. Over 8,000 kamikaze pilots would be used. Some never made it off the ground, but almost. And here we have the USS Hancock that was hit, nearly sunk by kamikaze. Over 35. Here 35 to 40, so it depends if they might have been other reasons, but at least 35 American ships were sunk by kamikaze. The Americans kept that secret from the American public, the Army, the Navy, because it would be so bad for morale. Here's another shot of the Hancock hitting that. The Japanese would also the last remaining battleships. They sent them out with just enough fuel to hit Okinawa for a big suicide attack that way. U.S. carrier planes got them before they got there, and sunk them all, and killed over 5,000 Japanese soldiers. Now, don't write this down. Just look at the numbers. This is unreal. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers. One thing, this is the most field that prisoners they took. How many Americans? What was the invasion of Japan? Okinawa caused them quite a start. Invasion would Japan be like this? How do we get an unconditional surrender? By the way, drum roll please. This is a good time for Flamingo Friday. Don't you agree? Are you ready? Yes! Good enough. And by the way, have you noticed two rats? Have you noticed a rat? You can't have this. I'm going to shred it up into more pieces, and I'm going to plant it. And I'm going to grow rugs for all of them. You're welcome. So, let's backtrack a little bit. What is the post-war world going to be like? Yalta. Something. That's this. Yalta. January to February 1945. The second conference of the big three. Who are the big three? Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin. But this time they're talking the post-war war. They know the war's about over. They don't know how long. They still think Germany might last well through the summer. And they think Japan will last well in the 46. They still think that. And Roosevelt, who just got elected to his fourth term, was noticeably declining. You can imagine. The presidency alone is tough. How that ages people. Combine that with polio. And he had to deal with depression, big war. If you want to see something amazing, you ought to see Barack Obama. He still looks young, but he looked like a little kid when he was elected president. And by after 8 years, he just looked like a 30-year-old. And he was actually 52. He's a young looking guy, so he just has that too. You know, being in my 90s, I get it. So I'm not have that same thing. What is it? Clean living. It's clean living, right? So, what about the post-war world? Remember the League of Nations that failed? They wanted to try again. The Allies were called the United Nations, so they called this new international body the United Nations. But, more importantly, the United Nations, if they decided any big issues on collective security, this is the part we have to get. It's called Security Council. And it would be 11, now it's 15 countries, but being all the big decisions for the United Nations. But to avoid the issues of Article 10, remember Article 10 of the League of Nations? 5 great powers can, any of the 5 can veto anything they didn't like. So avoid that issue. And who are the 5 great powers? US, UK, France, the Soviets, and even though China was a country ravaged by civil war and Japanese invasion, they all had a veto. So that's going to be the United Nations. And the thought was this international body would finally be one that could solve world peace. Is it going to work? Of course not. The reason is simple. What's going to get out of the United Nations if 5 countries have a veto? If anything the US wants, who's going to veto it during the Cold War? And vice versa, right? I mean, today it's a big issue about Israel. The vast majority of countries believe that issue is Israel. The big issue is Israel. Israel is committing an illegal invasion of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. The vast majority of the Security Council would vote to condemn Israel, but the US vetoes it every time. So that's a big example of how that works today. So, same thing happened to Ukraine. The UN could do nothing about the invasion of Ukraine because Russia vetoed it. Done. So, if people are worried about the power of the United Nations, if only, they got no real power at all. A little bit, you know, it's important, but it did not do what they hoped. Also, there would be war crimes trials. These would become known as the Nuremberg trials, the war crime trials. And one important thing about war crime trials, it's important to set the precedent that we will no longer allow crimes against humanity. But Who decides what a war crime is? The victors. Hey, are burning alive 120,000 civilians in one night? Is that a war crime? Not if you win. And the commander of the person who ordered the attack on Tokyo that did that made that statement I just told you. So, Germany would be divided up into 4 occupation zones with the idea that someday it would be unified again. They never thought the someday would be 1989, but someday. And Berlin, because it's in the middle of the Soviet occupation zone, it too is divided up into 4. Austria is going to be divided up into 4 too, but that would not become a big deal. This division would become the centerpiece of the Cold War. And so you're going to have this really weird situation where you're going to have French, US, and British occupation zones, and then inside the Soviet occupation zone, British, French, and American occupation zones. So my nephew who lives in Berlin, his father was born while it was still in the US occupation zone. In fact, they were sometimes called Americans because they were in the American occupation zone when he was born. So, one thing, the Soviets had already decided, we're taking half of Poland, we don't care. So they're going to carve off big hunks of Germany. They just said, we're doing it. That's just the way it is. Next, Russia pledged free elections in Eastern Europe, especially Poland. But the thing is, do you think Stalin meant that? No. I'm not going to allow a government I can't control my border. So that's the situation there. This will become a big deal because Stalin pledged it, and then a lot of people think he duped FDR. But do you want to go to war with the Soviet Union so Poland had free elections? I mean, seriously, it's a really tough issue. Germany also agreed to, or Germany will be made to pay reparations too. And even though, to the Soviets, even though we knew reparations were so bad after Versailles, Stalin demanded it. This would become a big issue too. And then last thing, I know the most about Ring, but last thing. The Soviets agreed to attack Japan 3 months after VE. They had a non-aggression pact with Japan. They were basically with the Germans, but the Soviets agreed to attack. VE Day is May 8th. That means August 8th. Right? You got that? Fine. Oh. What day did they drop? It was probably from August. It's not a coincidence. Want to catch that? It's not a coincidence. Do we want the Soviets to get an occupation zone in Japan? So, FDR, he looks weak, doesn't he? Everybody told you how he could stand. He gave his last State of the Union address. It's amazing what sure about 2 years ago they did this, you heard a crash and then somebody swore. And you heard it. That would be really, it was fun. Hey, it's ABBA. I've never had a Swedish group in a long time. Why? You know, if you come after that, I will tell you everything. Goodbye. He's having I haven't seen it. So these are.
Yes.
Yeah. It's Ryan, I used to help people less than normal. My grandma. How's that? Oh.
So it's like, yeah.
Sound good? Second the temperature. It's 36 now. 60 and 70. 79 on Tuesday. Been happy to rain on them. When I think of Flamingo Friday, I think of sweet ABBA.